So without further ado, let me very briefly introduce the panelists. We have a great panel here, starting with Professor Anil Sahasrabudhe. Samir was wrong. Anil was never at IIT Bombay, although I tried very hard all my life to get him there. He was in NERIST, then he was in IIT Guwahati, and he created
My
history
apologies.
when he completely turned around College of Engineering Pune to make it one of the best institutions as it was, several decades ago. We all fondly remember him, and of course, as chairman AICT, he has brought in some fantastic, phenomenal changes, and we're all grateful to him. Thank you, Professor Sahasrabudhe, for joining us. We have, of course, Dr. C. Rajkumar. We have already heard a lot about him, and we are delighted to have one of the youngest vice chancellors on our panels. Luckily, while he was giving his acceptance speech and other things, he actually commented upon a few things relevant to this panel itself. So that is perhaps very useful. I'm going strictly by the alphabetical order of the first name. So let me now talk about Meeta. Welcome, Meeta. It is very difficult for me to name you as a practitioner or as a policy maker because you do both. She handles policy, she handles practice, and she enjoys sharing all her thoughts with very wide audience. And curiously, she was an investment banker. So it's a very extraordinarily interesting journey Meeta has, and we look forward to having your wisdom added to the panel, Meeta. We have Dr. Pratibha Kundu. She works for Center for Budget and Governance Accountability. Frankly, I have never heard of accountability from any governance mechanism, but it's a good idea to have. Uh, her work, I mean, she also has worked as economist at the policy group of Infrastructure Development Finance Company. And she's an economist from JNU with her PhD. So we have now a true representative of economic wisdom that needs to go into the topic of the day, which is new education policy and economy. Last but not the least, I'm very happy to have Dr. Rukmini Banerjee. I'm seeing her for the first time, although I've been an admirer of her work as the director of what I call ASAR report or Annual Status of Education report. I've been reading those reports ever since they have been published, and I have been reminiscing on why things cannot be different. Unfortunately, I have personally worked only in higher education, whereas most of the ASAR reports concern the school education, which is very fundamental. But Rukmini, I'm so grateful that you have been able to join here. She is the CEO of Pratham, by the way, and who has not heard of Pratham in India, who is ever connected with any education system. Uh, she, uh, by the way, she is also uh, Delhi School of Economics student and a Rhodes Scholar. So we have very scholarly people, we have economists, we have practitioners, and all the people that we have, although they dream high, their feet are grounded on earth. And that is precisely what we need here. I look forward to nuggets of their wisdom. Let me remind the panel of the three main points that we need to come up with recommendations for. The first is how can we leverage the new educational policy to get the demographic advantage that we have been speaking incessantly for decades. And as we speak now, the demographic advantage is disappearing exactly in our side. So you have to be extremely careful. More importantly, from the point of view of this panel, we want to see how can we leverage this demographic advantage properly educated to unleash the economic potential. That is the ambition. The second point is, which is my personal favorite, how do you use technology to realize the ambitions of the new educational policy? I mean, I have been doing nothing else but that for last 20 years. with an ambition to achieve quality at scale. But neither quality nor scale has been achieved because we have crores and crores of people who are still looking for good quality of education. Some inputs from the panel will be useful. Last but not the least, how do we build world-class, globally competitive research institutions? Professor Rajkumar has already commented a bit on that, but we would expect a few more points on it. Just to remind all our attendees and of course our panelists, another friend of mine, Professor Pankaj Jalote, built a research institution called Triple IT in Delhi from scratch again. Although it's a very niche area institution, it's not a general institution, but it is possible from that and the example of Jindal and so many other examples, it's possible to do so. But we would like to see how can we make globally competitive research institutions, and that is the hard task. So without further ado, I would invite panelists to make observations. In this order itself we'll go. So we'll have the opening batsman as my friend Professor Anil Sahasrabudhe.
Thank you, Professor Deepak Phatak. The stalwarts are there in the panel, and Samir Kochar and the entire team of SKOCH, who have been instituting this award for a long time from 2014. In fact, in some way, directly, indirectly, 3 times I am a recipient. In 2004, when IIT Guwahati was selected, actually Gautam Barua was to receive it, but because some reason he couldn't make it and I went it. That is the time when I met Samir first time actually. Probably he was mistaking for S.C. Sahasrabudhe of IIT Bombay, so that is a clarification. I'm from IIT Guwahati. When I came to AICTE 2014, then 2018, we have received e-governance awards. So I think we have been very much aware of what SKOCH has been doing. And today, Professor Rajkumar, a splendid Vice Chancellor, young age, and the kind of leadership that he has provided, the right man selected for this award today. So congratulations once again from all of us here. And you also talked about Pankaj Jalote. So I think these are the right kind of leaders. We should understand how education and economy are correlated. And that is what is the subject matter of today. And today we have a new education policy, a very vibrant policy. Dr. Kasturi Rangan, with his all experience of ISRO and how we have developed Atmanirbharta in that, and that is being brought out in the education policy in different ways. Starting from the school system, changing from the present 10+2 to 5+3 + 3+4. A lot of emphasis on the mother tongue education. I think that is very important even at the higher education level. And we have been doing some activities. I will come back to that a little later because this empowerment of the people of this country is important. If you want to take our gross enrollment ratio from 27% to 50% in the next 10 to 15 years and enjoy the demographic dividend which we have, I think only speaking in English and only English education is not good enough, and therefore even higher education, maybe medical, maybe even engineering education being provided in our own respective Indian languages. I think that is one area which is also significantly important, which is talked about here. A lot of emphasis on innovation and research. I think this is very, very important. Skills on one side, that is hands-on skills, that thereby you actually know every aspect of engineering or technology or any matter for that matter, even accountancy, economics. I think many times we have a lot of theoretical knowledge pumped in our curricula, and then every teacher would like to cover the syllabus, something. But unfortunately, that uncovering the syllabus and not necessarily taking every aspect of it, but allow student to have enjoyment in whatever he's starting to learn, self-learning, lifelong learning, because technologies are constantly changing. If you don't do that, I think demographic dividend will not come. We will create educated mass, but which are all useless actually. And therefore, these 4 things are very, very important. How fundamentals are to be provided, how we provide them a lot of skill sets, both hands-on skills. Internships are important. How do we take students to become actually problem solvers? And that's where our initiative of a lot of hackathons, which we have started off, and which the Prime Minister was often recognizing that, and not only Smart India hackathons of software variety, but also hardware variety, which we have done in the 4 years. Now we have India-Singapore hackathon. Only this month we had ASEAN-India hackathon on the blue economy. That is very, very important, whether it is the security on the seas, actually, in terms of the transport, in terms of the oil spill that happened, all the challenges being addressed by young students, of second year, third year, undergrad students is marvelous actually. There is a lot of talent which exists, a lot of information on the web in terms of whether YouTube or Google or MOOCs courses, but how you convert that into knowledge, how that knowledge is converted into wisdom, how that wisdom is made use of in solving the problem. I think that's all about how the new national education policy can really recharge what really education is all about. We have forgotten what is the role of education for the last 7 decades. Probably we are reinventing. For example, our ancient wisdom of Gurukula system, or whether it is Takshilas and Nalandas of the world. Now, a new variety of universities, whether it is IIIT, which you mentioned, or OP Jindal, which is also mentioned here, or the transformation of COEP you mentioned. All of these are very, very valid and important in order to really achieve the demographic divide. A strong, confident person graduating should be able to do anything that he wants to do in life. And that confidence can be built up by developing entrepreneurial ability while they are in the colleges. Therefore, curriculum is to be tweaked in a manner that a lot of choices are available for students. An engineering student may do music, a physics student may do a dance or a drama, probably along with what he's doing, and the liberal arts, which many universities are now talking about, should be all part of this NEP, and which has to be implemented in the right perspective. Now, coming to the use of technology, which you are passionate, you are the starting point in terms of C-Deep in IIT Bombay, subsequently 1,000 teachers training program, 10 KT program. I remember all of those initial experiments and taking cue from that, as well as what IIT Bombay COEP had live classes being engaged. I think many of you people probably do not realize that Dr. F.C. Kohli, who is no more now, he was the man who talked about, even before MOOCs came into existence, before Khan Academy, he forced IIT Bombay to have a video conferencing equipment in IIT Bombay and College of Engineering Pune, and the live classes of Bombay were given to College of Engineering Pune students. The same level of education which IIT students get should get to any other college student as well. I think that was the use of technology, but one-on-one. But that you cannot scale up, and therefore, whether it is T10 KT model, which Deepak ji has already perfected, we have gone ahead with that. And I would like to mention here that one of the most important components of education system is teacher. So many times this doubt is raised that when technology is there, when so many courses are all available on the platforms, why do we require teacher? And teacher as a very important role of being a mentor, advisor, guide, philosopher, in order to shape the students is never going to be stopped, and it is going to be continuing. But we must leverage the use of technology. And therefore, there are two things which we have been doing. Number one, teacher certification program of 8 modules. We have started that for the higher education in technical education. Without doing those 8 modules, doing internship for 4 weeks, that means 1 month, and then practicing it for 1 semester under the tutelage of a senior faculty member of that college as a mentor. He will not be regularized. He has to clear all these 10 modules. And then he will become from a contract faculty or a temporary faculty to a regular faculty. I think this is a game changer. In this, how do we use technologies there? We all know about NPTEL, we know virtual labs, we know Swayam platform, which is created indigenously. We have various worldwide platforms, also MIT edX or Coursera type. But how do we really use them actually, whether it is in terms of blended learning, full-time course? I think these are the things which are very relevant and which is their part of the curriculum. We are already allowing both UGC, AICTE regulation, 20% of the courses from MOOC are allowed. They are now increased to 40%. Only 2 days back, the regulation of UGC has come. Now AICTE will also regulate to increase it to 40% of the course. That means wherever, whatever is possible, learn from the best in the field. Your college may not have an expertise in that particular area. Why can't you learn it from someone else who is at a distant place? And that is what we were able to do it. And the pandemic really showed the way. So we were all time, earlier we were in a half-hearted mode going with the online education, but online education has become almost a mainstay education. But nevertheless, brick and mortar universities and colleges and a lot of other activities like sports, games, drama, music has to happen in the face-to-face mode. That apart, a lot of complementary work can be done through the education, through the online education. I think that is very, very significant, which is there in the policy as well. Now, during this pandemic, I would like to mention a couple of very interesting examples that we have done. We were hesitant whether such kind of training is possible in the online mode. T10KT gave us this confidence and we started off. We have a program called Universal Human Values and a student induction program of 3 weeks duration. We wanted that all students should be engaged in not just the rote learning, but also in terms of empowerment of respect, responsibility, also values, ethics, all of that. How do we give it? Empathy. This is possible only when we have teachers trained in that, and teachers in turn take care of every 20 students by one faculty member. And this program was launched 3 years ago. But pandemic suddenly stopped all of this because we couldn't have this kind of program for faculty development as well as for students to be engaged. So we went online and we started conducting these workshops, and initially with 50, 100, 200, and we have gone even such numbers as 800, 1000 vice chancellors, heads of the department, faculty members, right from assistant professor to professor, attending every week for 5 days duration. And we have trained 40,000 teachers in this pandemic 10 months of period. Next, we also had a teacher training program for new technologies or emerging technologies like AI, machine learning, deep learning, robotics, 3D printing, cloud computing, cyber security, blockchain. I think these are part of the curriculum now, and unless teachers are trained in that, we cannot continue. And your T10KT program we have taken forward, and every workshop is of 5 days duration. And fortunately, earlier we would probably have only 50 people in one workshop. We would have a couple of experts from nearby place. Today, pandemic helped us in going online and get experts from US, get experts from Japan or France or Australia, west to east, both sides. And then full 5-day program, including assignments, examination for faculty member, and then giving certificate. We trained through 905 workshops till today, 112,000 faculty in these different 10 emerging area technologies. I think that is the power of technology. I think we must scale it up. Already London has, world record has appreciated this and given the certificate that this is the largest faculty development program ever held. In 1 year, we have trained 112,000 teachers. Our target is 150,000. Another 2 months are there, we will reach that target. We have
absolutely wonderful. I think you have answered a couple of important questions out of the 3. So thank you very much for your disposition. May I request Professor Rajkumar to add to the points that he had already made, particularly with respect to creating world-class universities.
Thank you very much, Professor Phatak, and thank you to our distinguished panelists, all of them, and of course, Coach and Samir. Thank you, Professor Sachibudhe, for setting the tone for this panel. What I thought I will do is that, there is obviously a very big aspiration for India to be wanting to have world-class universities. So I think it's, first of all, we need to recognize that this aspiration to build and nurture competitive research-based world-class universities is a legitimate aspiration. For a while, there was a discussion that was taking place, particularly in India, but also around the world, that should we be even aspiring to have world-class universities? Because we all know that world-class universities require substantial financial resources, and whether developing countries in general should even have such an aspiration. And that question was indeed, there were some skepticism around the world that maybe developing countries should not be aspiring to. And there are many, including me, have fundamentally rejected those arguments that aspiration to build world-class universities should not be confined to developed countries in the world. Every country in the world, including India, has a legitimate aspiration and indeed should be able to put in its own resources, but also its imagination and vision with a view to establishing competitive world-class universities. So I think the threshold aspect of democratizing a high quality education with a greater degree of inclusivity deeply embedded in the institutional cultures that prevail in developing countries, including India, should be part of a natural evolution of a higher education system. And India, of course, over 2,000 years ago, as Professor Sachrabuddhe said, that we do have the legacy of institutions that have precisely done that. Now, when it comes to actually building those institutions, we need to recognize that there are, in my view, 5 critical elements that are essential for us to build world-class universities. And I'll quickly run through it. I'm conscious of the lesser time we have. So the first and most important thing is we need to empower our universities with greater autonomy and greater regulatory freedom to promote creativity that will expand the horizons of Indian higher education landscape. And there are many things that have happened in the last several years, including the vision of graded autonomy promoted by both the UGC and the Human Resource Development Ministry, the autonomy that has been given to the IIMs and other institutions, the effort that has been created now with a view to creating the institutions of eminence, and we are very fortunate that OP Jindal Global University is one. All these things are part of that effort to empower universities, and world-class universities can only be built and nurtured with a strong, autonomous, and a liberal regulatory freedom. The second thing which I have passionately argued for many years is to break the public-private university divide. This has been one of the curse of Indian higher education system. I have always maintained that we have, the pejorativeness that has been associated with the private university, the deeply embedded institutionalized forms of discrimination that has been meted out to private institutions, that has unfortunately undermined the ability of Indian higher education institutions to achieve its fullest growth and evolution. We need to break this divide, and we need to leverage the private sector in particular to generate employment and to raise significant financial resources, and that will ultimately promote an inclusive higher education system. In fact, the reality that we are facing today is that over 70% of Indian higher education institutions are in the private sector. We need to recognize the significant role that the private sector is playing. Here I'm talking about among the 40,000 plus colleges and the nearly 1,000 universities. In this sort of higher education ecosystem, the private sector is playing such a significant role, and it's important for us to build a culture of philanthropy, infusing significant financial resources that is available with the private sector to be able to create not-for-profit institutions in the private sector. The kind of efforts that were put in place to build, let's say, a Harvard University, which is a private university, Yale, Stanford, MIT, all of which are private universities. That type of vision needs to be brought to India in a very significant manner for us to build, world-class universities. The third thing that the national education policy talks about, which is very useful, is that we need to bring in a significant, funding in the form of the National Research Foundation that has been promoted by the NEP, but also to create a better research governance and orientation towards emphasizing the need for promoting a research culture. This has been one of the huge challenges that we are facing in India. Most Indian higher education institutions and universities are at best teaching institutions. At worst, they don't do either teaching or research at the level they should. In that context, we need to do a number of things, including maintaining a good faculty-student ratio, which will enable the institutions to give time for faculty, to create an opportunity for faculty to have the time and space to pursue research, to reduce the teaching responsibility of faculty so that they can spend adequate time in pursuing research. It's also important for us to de-bureaucratize the entire funding processes associated with research grants as well as other types of funding. Now, I was actually working in Hong Kong as a young faculty member, as a lecturer, and I have to share with you that the kind of generosity that the institution would provide, and by the way, it was a public university, no questions asked when it comes to providing, conference grants, research grants. In fact, the research grants and conference grants was pushed to the faculty to take more and giving them freedom and autonomy to use those resources as opposed to creating numerous bottlenecks and multiple levels of bureaucracy that is marred by inefficiencies, which has unfortunately resulted in creating disincentives for many Indian faculty members to pursue research grants. So we need to develop a culture of research. Now, this culture of research and our significant emphasis on publications becomes important for us to be part of the research university and benchmarked internationally. The fourth aspect,
Rajkumar, I think in the interest of time, but I'm happy that
I will finish it in 1 minute.
Okay.
The fourth is international collaborations. All of us are familiar with it. And the fifth is to promote multidisciplinarity. And lastly, I will say that this entire aspiration to have world-class universities should be based upon a transparent, understanding of how institutions around the world are assessed. We need to embrace international rankings such as QS and Times Higher Education and other such rankings, which will benchmark Indian universities and their abilities to make a significant impact in the world, arena when it comes to assessing the world-class universities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Rajkumar. I'm happy you mentioned several points. I think I would also like to tell all the participants and the panelists that I have been amongst a lucky set of few thousand faculty members who have been part of the IIT, NIT system, where the kind of complete autonomy that you mentioned, I have enjoyed it for all of the 50 years. And fortunately, I have never seen the kind of bureaucratic tangles that appear to be involved in various grants that come from the government. I think the government has been particularly kind to the IIT system. And I think the new institutions which became autonomous, Professor Sahasrabudhe will acknowledge that institutions like COEP or VJTI or 50 such colleges, the only problem is they have to struggle with the imposition of certain rules by the state governments rather than any grant kind of thing. If you remember in technical education, that TechIP program has provided absolutely wonderful grants for furthering the research. But of course, we have a long way to go. I entirely agree with what you're saying. May I request Meeta to share her thoughts briefly, please? Meeta.
Thank you very much. I'm going to say half the things that I'd planned to say, really, in the interest of time. And I think I'm going to firstly agree with everything that has been said before and therefore not repeat it. But also, what I'd like to do in my little time slot here is emphasize the economic aspect of education and bring it back to that. And when we say that education needs to be something that boosts the economy, what we are talking about effectively is we are talking about an intergenerational impact. We are talking about a multiplier impact. We're talking about creating employability. We are talking about practical things like that, which of course ultimately means skilling up, which is exactly what Anil Sahasrabudhe spoke about. But we are also talking about, and this goes to Rajkumarji, we are also talking about excellence for all. Because so far what has happened is we have got trapped over the years in the affordability trap. Our big challenge was, could we do excellence for all or could we do mediocrity for the masses? Whereas what we really, really need is excellence at every stage, which is where you speak about the research aspect of it. But it's not just the research aspect of it. It's about having that spark, that flint. In the previous panel, Shekhar Shahji talked about having the differential between somebody who's only been educated in India and somebody who has been educated abroad. Now, I have only been educated in India, but I have taught and researched and engaged with education in various countries, especially the UK. So London Business School is where all of my spark and my learning came from, in a way, because I was researching and working over there. So I have to admit that there is something missing over here. And that is what we seek to in today's conversation. And what now I want to take the student perspective and say, when a student wants to embrace that spark or is seeking that spark, the NEP is actually enabling it. I will completely concede and I have boosted it at the school level. Rukmini, yourself, you've talked about the primary school realignment. There's a lot in the middle school that has happened that encourages this spark of creativity. But when we talk economics, we are talking about creating value. And these are two separate conversations. One is the value conversation. The value conversation comes from, in higher education, actually understanding, not just in hackathons going up and pitching, but what do you do with it? What happens next? Did you actually create anything transformative? So reconciling that with your school education. Of course, we are in a post-rote learning stage. Absolutely no doubt about that. So this is about the conjunction of creativity and the creation of value. But this conjunction can only happen at scale if we have discovery mechanisms. And for the ordinary student, we do not have discovery mechanisms at scale in our country. How does that student find that one professor across 40,000 universities, where that one professor is going to mentor them to greatness? Whether it is research or whether it is an organization or a startup or whatever it is, all of us need the gravitas of great professors like those of you who are here on this panel. Without your support, without the grown-ups, the kids are really not going to make it. We know that, even if they don't know that. And this is true. You look at 30-year-old CEOs with a paucity of, let's say, empathy, or the kind of edutech that is in play today. Edutech is basically exam tech that is in play, and again, in transition. But the discovery mechanisms to scale, I think, are clearly missing. And I think, and that is the kind of institution building that I would seek today. Lastly, I'm just going to talk about Rajkumarji's talking about the league tables, the globalization. In a perfect world, I would definitely say that, and I would agree with you. But I would also agree that in India, we have opportunities that are contiguous with that, are aligned to that, but are slightly different. Because in the people, purpose, process framework, we have tended to get trapped in the process, whereas our opportunity lies at the integration of purpose and people. And what do we have over here? I mean, Rukmini, you're a classic example of bringing people and purpose together over here. Because what you did was notice that here is an opportunity for people to create empathy. Here is, for example, technology that can enable that. And here is how we can create excellence within that. So I would actually suggest, very briefly and jumping over a lot of the logical steps in between, that we in India are in the business of care tech going forward, because we need people-oriented care giving, community building institutional frameworks. We do not need robots to replace human beings in factories, for example. As an illustration of that, we need robots to replace the indignities of labor, that aspect of labor, of technology. I would rather, more than an ISRO engineer, I'm going to respect the person who creates and scales up technology for drain cleaning, while still retaining high employment level. It's care tech that we need to enable in our country, and therefore the purpose is slightly different from what the league tables describe. I've rushed through this one, but I would really love to.
I understand, Meeta. Thank you very much. I would only like to slightly modify your statement that while we should definitely honor the care tech people, there is no reason not to honor the ISRO engineers as well. Because for God's sake, they are also doing something very substantial and adding not just the pride of the nation, but also adding to human knowledge in general. But I stray aside. Sorry.
Absolutely in agreement with you, taking inspiration from Samir Kochhar. My son is a physicist working on exoplanets.
Thank you. So may I invite Pratibha Kundu now, Dr. Pratibha?
Thank you. Thank
But
you.
limit yourself to 5 minutes.
Yeah, I'm trying. So whenever we're talking about Atmanirbhar Bharat, obviously there is talk about realization of the whole demographic dividend. We have to keep in mind that 2020 to 2025 is the period when we'll be in the peak of the 15 to 19 age group population. At the same time, some of the indicators that also we need to keep in our mind, there is only 55% youth female who are illiterate, whereas 30% youth who don't have any sort of education or training or employment. Our female to male labor force participation rate is 21%. So when we looking at these indicators, then it tells us that a clear education policy and action plan is fundamental to reap this benefit. And that's why in this context, we should talk about this National Education Policy 2020. Now, I want to focus here on the school education, because I believe school education is the foundation. And if there is a better school education, will get a better higher education. At the same time, better higher education will give us good teachers, good educators, good policy makers. So in my presentation, I want to convey 4 points. The first, I believe, that there is a significance of public provisioning of education, especially in the context of COVID. We have seen that it has the experience that we had, that there is increase in gender inequality in education, rural urban divide, digital divide. So there is need for importance of the public provisioning of education is now more. And in this context, we should talk about the public financing aspect, public financing of education. Now, whenever we talk about public financing, one of the very common opinion that most of the people hold is that over time there is increase in education budget, but at the same time there is not concurrent improvement in learning outcomes or in the service delivery per se. But I want to focus, I want to mention here one of the things that we should not this is not a very straight jacket argument. We shouldn't the discussion of the budget, school education budget, very limited to the final messaging of we are not getting the better learning outcomes. We need to ask some pertinent question. We need to deep dive at how the public financing is happening. So first question is whether there is adequate resources in comparison to requirement. We have seen there is huge shortage of teachers. There is a shortage of infrastructure, not proper teachers training. And the next question comes, whatever resources we are getting, whether that composition of resource distribution is satisfactory. And there, some of the areas which over time, because our overall resource envelope pie is so limited for school education, so most of the times it's basically reprioritization of resources across different components. And in this process, the areas which got neglected is secondary education. Just I want to share one figure. A pupil teacher ratio is one of the good indicators. In Bihar, for 1900 students, there is one English teacher. In West Bengal, for 900 students, there is one maths teacher. So this is the scenario. And other than secondary education, the other very important components like teachers training, the quality related interventions, monitoring, mainstreaming out of school children, these are very much related with the quality component and better learning outcomes, but these are getting neglected. Recently, we have got our union budget, and we have seen that there is cut in the overall education budget as well as school education budget. But in the context when we talk about this role of union government, it's important, but we should not miss the role that states are playing, because the federal fiscal structure in the public financing we should need to discuss. And this is more important in the light of 15th Finance Commission, because we have seen the 15th Finance Commission report was tabled, and it has almost more or less retained the similar kind of fiscal autonomy that has been given to states in the 14th Finance Commission period. In CBG, in our study, we have seen that not much of the states actually have used this additional resource envelope for better expenditure on social sector and especially school education. So again, we have to see what is happening in the 15th FC period. because if states are not stepping up along with union government, then the whole challenges, the problem of public financing will never be addressed. We won't get the preferred learning outcome. So much, as much as we talk about the accountability, but these issues will not be resolved. But when we look at the NEP, we see that actually NEP is talking about public provisioning. It rightly acknowledges this. There is need of public investment. It endorses the 6% of GDP is required. It's talking about equitable public education system. At the same time, NEP is also mentioning that under allocation is basically the challenges, and this under allocation is also leading to the underutilization, and there is underutilization in because of there is systemic bottlenecks, because of there is bottlenecks in terms of delay in fund flow, there is very complicated administrative procedures. And so NEP is talking about and highlighted some of the very critical areas which need substantial resources. So in NEP, we see that there is more emphasis on teachers training, on both teaching and non-teaching staff, on nutrition, on online education, on digital infrastructure. As you are asking about the technical education in the time of COVID, the technology in education. In the time of COVID, we have seen that there is really a need of blended education system. At the same time, we have seen that only 8% households where the school-going children are there, they have access to both devices and internet connection. And another common thing is access to a better quality electricity service that is also not available. So if we really want to do better in terms of improving the digital education, if we have to invest on these basic things, and then only.
Yes, Pratibha, I entirely agree with you. Thank you very much. I would just like to point out a couple of things. You mentioned about the new education policy saying that a higher percentage of GDP should be spent on education. For your information, I have been hearing this for all the 50 years that I have taught, starting with the first year in 1971. And my senior colleagues tell me that this was initiated even earlier. So it continues to remain a pipe dream for most of us, but we look forward to something substantial happening there. The second point I would like to mention, and you correctly pointed out that school education is fundamentally more important. One of the reasons that nobody talks about a gross enrollment ratio in the higher education system greater than 50% is because it is not achievable. The total number of Indians who are of college going age, only 50% of them have completed 12th standard.
Exactly.
So others are drop out at 12th, 10th and earlier. So unless we substantially improve the school education, there is no hope for further spread of the higher education. Yes. Anyway, last but not the least, we're all very keen to listen to Rukmini, all yours, Rukmini. And let me once again compliment you for amazing work that you do, which is an eye-opener, not just for the Indian educators, but the entire population of the country. Thank you so much.
Sir, you are very kind. And even though I'm Pratham, I am Shesh on this panel, and I will take full use of it. So very quickly, I would say that as far as NEP is concerned, we feel that wo asar ka asar ab hua hai, because in NEP, I think that it's very, very clear message that comes across is that unless you really work hard on the foundation, you're not going to get your dividends or interest or anything. And there is a box, I think, somewhere very early in the NEP document, which says that if you're not able to use, if you're not able to reach foundational literacy and numeracy by standard 3, the baki ka document is almost not worth reading. So I take great strength from that to say that, like in our families, and I know LIC is one of your sponsors for this event, and I am from a generation where the only thing my father did was make an LIC policy for me when I was born. I think that that's what we need to do, that the investments that we are now going to make, whatever we have done with the children who we've had in school so far is one thing. But I think that this age group of 3 to 8, it's about, there is roughly about 25 million children in each age group. That's 150 million children, and hanging on to them and doing whatever we can with the resources we have for the next 15 years will, I think, decide the future of India for the next 100 years. And so I think that is a very clear thing to keep in mind. The other urgent thing that NEP doesn't say necessarily, but I think if I go back to what Meeta said, 14 to 18, another 100 million, they are going to enter the labor market immediately, or they already have. What are we going to do immediately this year, next year for this age group? And again, Pratibha, monies will come and we'll keep analyzing, but whatever we have in hand, I am a housewife at heart. Whatever money is in hand, I must maximize the use of that to get the biggest bang for the current buck. More bucks are very welcome, but right now, whatever I have in hand, I need to use that. I had various things I was going to say, but you have such a good panel and people have made such comments that I feel, and also it's very rare for me to be on a platform with people from higher education. So I want to take some thoughts that I had on that. Some years ago, I was invited by JNU to come and talk on the connection between basic education and higher education in India. So the person who invited me, I said, I'll come, but I have nothing to say. She said, why? I said, because there's no connection. So she said, why don't you come to JNU and say that? So I went to JNU and I said that, and I've never been invited back again, because I said publicly that there is really not much connection between our basic education and our school education. And I actually mean this quite seriously, that while we are talking about how will this this NEP's dream for the first time to say, take young children seriously, it won't happen unless the grown-ups take it seriously as well. And by the grown-ups, I mean higher education and every other kind of institution in India. I'm myself from Bihar. And some years ago, and we were working in our own primary education work in Rajgir block of Nalanda district. And that's the block in which Nalanda University is coming up. So I was in a village and we were talking to, people in the village and some older people. And here is a comment that one of them made. I think one of them was the Mukhya in that village. He said, "Arey, hamare gaon ke school mein dhang ka principal 20 saal mein nahi diya aur Vishwavidyalaya banane chale." And I think these are the kinds of things. That block does not have a college. That block does not have a place where the immediate people can go. And therefore, I would say that, when we are thinking about, high class, world class, or whatever institutions, we have to think what is the responsibility of that institutions and the individuals in those institutions to the immediate catchment area, or even to a broader community which has no hope of ever going to that institution. We do ASAR every year, and you have very kindly mentioned ASAR. It's done in every district in the country. And in every district, there's a local organization and usually an institution that does it. And time and again, we've been at this for 15 years. It is actually doing ASAR in Kashmir, in Arunachal, in Assam, not a problem. It is very easy to mobilize and excite district colleges to be able to participate, because they are looking for an organized opportunity to reach out and add something from their immediate area. And time and again, I've seen college students say, कि मुझे तो आइडिया ही नहीं था कि मेरे जिले में फलाने गांव तक पहुंचने के लिए 12 घंटे लग सकते हैं. And do you know that the condition is here and there? Most difficult we have is in being able to mobilize what I call capitalist institutions, which have nothing to do with capital as in money, but are in state capitals. Okay, because those are somehow cut off from whatever is happening in the ground. And so my feeling, and this is all I think connected to NEP, is that what is our vision of this if we want to make our national education policy come true, rather than segmenting it, saying that school education will be taken care of by the school education department, at most by the ICDS people, and then higher education will be taken care of by the institutions that regulate or support or whatever higher education. I think it's very important to think of this as a whole continuum, because unless those 150 million children today are invested in thoroughly for the next 15 years, we are all irrelevant and our futures are irrelevant. And so I think that this, this notion of world class or whatever class, again, I'd come back. I mean, my own entire life is around, ASAR has taught me a lot. I find that this is the Assert tool. I don't know if you may be familiar with it. This is it. Can you read a story? Can you read a paragraph? And can you read a few lines? When we developed this, we didn't do it thinking about anybody else other than who are the kids in our villages, in our slums, and can they read? But this tool is now used in 15 or 20 countries around the world. And we've given a tough fight to the testing empires of the world called PISA and other things. Because what we developed for extreme use in our own context turns out is useful for many people. So I think there are many pathways to when things become globally relevant, and they're not always by taking what is being done in many other parts of the world. But I think in developing what we need here, and I'm not necessarily making a big case to say that the global and the local are different. But I think when we do something extremely important and which has great value for our own, it is usually of great value to other people as well. And so in my own experience of higher education, I am very inspired by the potential of our district colleges. And I think if you had, 1,000 strong district colleges, you will come out and have, people who will be able to. So to me, from being in, whatever universities I've been in, I found in the US, for example, the community colleges as a very inspiring place where people can jump over many kinds of things. So we have invested well in, I think, certain high-level institutions. We have not invested as well in our basic education. And NEP gives us the moment between COVID and NEP. The combination is we have to seize the moment that we have today and to be able to convert this opportunity. Because I've been saying that while we have a long history and a past and we can keep analyzing it, now we have a Rakshas in front of us and we can blame everything on the Rakshas. We can say, ye aaj ki jo halat hai, wo COVID ke wajah se hai. So therefore, to recover, we can do so many things that I think we've needed to do. So I think, I appeal to higher education to say, believe in the NEP, believe in that box. And if we can achieve that, then many of the things going ahead will be solved.
Thank you so much, Rukmini. I would just like to mention that I differ with you slightly on your contention that there is no connection between in fact, I can see that people flow from so-called one component of education to another very naturally. And when they do so, to my humble mind, it appears that they bring with us not just the basic academic preparedness, but they bring with them the attitude and culture which they have picked up, and they bring with them the values and ethics which they have picked up. And these, unfortunately, do not change substantially later. And I personally believe, as a teacher of some standing, that these things matter. The attitude, the culture, the values, the ethics, unless these are factored into your aspirations could easily turn into greed. You may completely lose out on empathy. I think these values are built first at home and subsequently in the school education. And I would at least suggest humbly that school education and higher education is intrinsically connected, although the current system of measurement does not permit us to see that connection straight away. But I digress. Thank you so much. We are already substantially late, but I would suggest that instead of having a counter round, which will take another 5 or 7 minutes, I'm thankful to the panelists because each panelist has identified 2 or 3 very specific points, which I will take it as the panel's input for action, which can be then passed on to the government. I will request Dr. Gurshar and Dhanjal to please send me the recording of this session. I have taken some notes, but if I can get that recording, then on behalf of the panel, I will consolidate the recommendations that have emerged out of this so that we won't further delay the next panel. But I'm delighted. I would only like to mention one thing which Professor Sahasrabudhe probably wrongly mentioned. He talked about we'll have educated masses. I wish we have educated masses. I think what he meant was we may have literate masses. but not educated masses. We would love to have educated masses because, see, we have not spoken about other things because primarily our focus was on economics. But I think the fundamental purpose of education is also to create a decent thinking human being and a good citizen of the nation. I don't think we can forget that fundamental expectation from any education. Everything else should be doubted around. And for me, I have long stopped calling my country as a developing country. We are no more a developing country. We can fight one-on-one with many countries, including on economic things. I think I have tremendous faith that China and India are actually tilting the balance of economic and financial fulcrum to this side of the world. And if you have read Yuval Noah Harari or Homo Deus or other things, you can see that, in fact, there are so many books. I am convinced that in the next 30, 40 years, and that is why it becomes very important to really convert our demographic advantage to a variety of things, including economic things, is because there is no doubt in my mind that the fulcrum of economics is already changing. What was the developed world so far would remain perhaps a reasonably developed world, but essentially the financial decisions of the world will now start getting made in China, India, and other Asian countries. I am very convinced about it. I am only 73 years old, so I still have about 25 years to watch the fun, and I am sure that I will see something substantial happening. My friend Upendra Sinha is, I think, waiting for the. Is that the next panel? Yes. So I'm very sorry, Sinha Saab. I really apologize for holding back your time. But to be fair to my own panel, I will tell you that we ourselves were passed the baton rather late. Then there was an outdoor ceremony which took 10 minutes. So I think I'm still finishing exactly in the original time that was allocated. All yours, Dr. Gurcharan Tanja.
Well, Dr. Phatak, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure listening to you, and your discussions are extremely enjoyable, very invigorating, and full of knowledge. It has always added to our kitty. And at the same time, thank you all the panelists, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us on this very interesting session on new education policy and economy.